So, guys, I want to talk about All Elite Wrestling, and one of the big disappointments about AEW is All Out is that a lot of people were hoping that there may be a women's blood and guts match, and it looked like that they were going down that direction with a lot of multi-women tag team matches, but they're only just doing a women's fatal four-way, and they're also doing Riho versus Mercedes Moné. So I really think that what AEW needs to do is they really need to study the TNA Knockouts division. And what I mean by that was that when Gail Kim and Awesome Kong, like 6 or 7 years ago, were wrestling each other, they actually did such a good job that they drew a lot of viewership, like the most viewership of their segment. They actually main evented a TNA show, and they just got a lot of people watching. Really, like a lot of people would say that. Unfortunately, when you look at the women's division, no, when you look at the women's movement in professional wrestling, or like Women's Wrestling Matters, there's a lot of people who say AJ Lee, and yes, she was part of it, but there was actually two things that are extremely overlooked. Like number one was China in WWE because she wrestled men. She had really great matches. She was not just somebody who was sexy. She was a badass that did a lot for women's wrestling and broke a lot of barriers. She gets underlooked because she did pornography, and she's also underlooked because she used to be in a relationship with Triple H, and it's just like they just want to under celebrate her. And then the other thing that's under celebrated is the Knockouts division in TNA wrestling, because Gail Kim and Awesome Kong having matches that were taken seriously. A lot of the feuds were taken seriously, even with the Beautiful People and other groups. A lot of women's wrestling was taken very seriously in TNA wrestling. It's under celebrated for a few reasons. Like obviously, the big one is that TNA was a rival and a competitor to WWE years ago. The other thing now is that they have a partnership, so they almost want to make it look like that they're friends, that you're not rivals, forget the past. And then the other thing too is a lot of that stuff that they did with Beautiful People and other things in TNA wrestling were TV-14, and the Beautiful People were always in lingerie and other things like that. So they're probably just like, oh, we don't want to remember our past where women were in skimpy outfits or whatever. Really, like you see ODB, and she always wore like I said, like she didn't wear like trunks. She always wore her regular underwear underneath her clothes. Really, so part of that's one of the reasons why they want to forget that. But I think that with AEW, they can remember that and say, hey, there's a lot of things that they can take, really. And I think that a couple things that they can take is what I've said a lot about professional wrestling. I think Crime Time said it best, which is you take your personality and you shoot it up by 200%. Like, for example, you look at the Beautiful People, or I think it's Lacey Von Erich, and they're just like sexy women and they're mean girls. So what would happen if you have somebody like Harley Cameron, and she is two types of people? She's kind of like an eccentric musician, really, but you also say too, when she came to AEW, she felt a little lost in the shuffle. She felt a little nervous, and she felt like, like she doesn't really belong, and she's trying to belong, or she wants to accomplish things. Like, well, what if you turned that very determined, I feel overwhelmed, something that people can relate to, into 200% of that? What would happen if you have Billy Starks, who feels like she's lost without Athena? And what would happen if you kind of turn that into a character? What would happen if you turn Athena into somebody who is a control freak, is a snob, also wants recognition because she's been a champion with probably their least famous women's title? Like, it's really ROH, then ROH Women's, the TBS, and then the AEW Women's Championship. What if they did that with her? Like, where she wants to be like, hey, I want the other titles because I really want to matter, and other things like that. The next thing is you look at somebody like Nyla Rose, who I feel like has a really great voice, underrated. Like, is like this, I'm this big powerhouse, I break bitches type of person, really. What if you have Tekla, who got fired from her past job for assaulting like the president of her company? What if you made her like this outlaw, I don't give a fuck about the rules type of person, really? Like, the only woman on that roster, in my opinion, that does anything like that is Toni Storm, because she is supposed to be this eccentric actress. So she's acting like the Sandman one week, the next week, and most of the time she acts like she's in Sunset Boulevard, or Marilyn Monroe, really. So there has to be or All About Eve. So there has to be maybe that kind of trade as well, really, like amplify things by like 100, 200%. The next big thing they did in the TNA wrestling is that they did a lot of single one-on-one feuds, and that's kind of been one of the big issues with AEW. If you do multi-person feuds or faction versus factions, you run into tag team versus tag team, triple team versus triple team, 6-man versus 6-man, 8-man versus 8-man, and that's also true of the women, as well, really. And the problem is that if you have way too many tag teams, you really or multi-person matches, you really can't follow what's going on. You really have no motivation for these people. Like sometimes, yes, you want all-star, star-studded stuff, or you want to have tag team matches. Like I want to see the trios titles, Hurt Syndicate versus the Ops, and then you have like Joe and Bobby Lashley. Then you have Hobbs and Bobby Lashley, and then you kind of tease future matches. That's the only reason why these tag team matches work. Or you look at the Royal Rumble when you had Umaga and the Great Khali look at each other like, oh well, look at these two big bad motherfuckers, really. So I think that that's also kind of missing too, is that if you don't that they don't really have a purpose for multi-person matches and stuff like that. But I do think that having like singles feuds or multi-person matches with at least single feuds is good. Like Tekla and Aminata need to be something. I've said this many times. Marina Shafir and Will Nightingale, the fact that they never fought each other one-on-one is a big missed opportunity. The fact that you have Nyla Rose, who could be in the Hurt Syndicate, or Nyla Rose, who could be in the Death Riders, because she's loud, she has a big voice, really, and she challenges women, she goes after titles, that could be something. The fact that you have Thunder Rosa, who could be an LFI, really, and then she could kind of be like the woman of that group and go after women's titles, really, could be something. So I really think with the Knockouts division, there's a lot of things that they can do, really. They can learn is this building great women's feuds. And a lot of the stuff with Kong and Gail Kim was like, was really just like, you beat the unstoppable Kong, who's like this big bad bitch, or is Gail Kim and Kong, the smaller one, the immovable force versus the irresistible object, the bigger and the badder versus the badder type of thing, really. But just throwing them in random tag team matches, doing these repeat matches and other things like that. That just it's just like all, it's just all it's all repeat wrestling, really. I can't think of a e word that's a synonym for repetitive on the spot, really. But there is a lot of things that they can really do by their women and stuff like that, So like study like what they did in TNA wrestling with the Knockouts division. Study how they build feuds, study how they build characters, study how they build a lot of one-on-one stuff, and study like maybe things you need to do as a women's casino gauntlet, feast or fired, how to take personalities and amplify it, really, because there's a lot that's really underdeveloped in the women's division in AEW. And do you want to see Ruby Soho, Paige, Mariah May, and a few other people just do what some of them did, which was you go to WWE to become that big star, really? They need to work a lot of people that they have. And I think the most successful woman in their company, the first one is Toni Storm, but you also look at Jade Cargill, because they did a lot with Jade Cargill by making her like this badass, hard to beat type of woman. But you see how she got over. You see how like there are men actually going down, like bowing to her like she's a fucking goddess, really, because of how she kind of was whooping ass and stuff like that, really. So it's almost like there's so much in the women's division that they can do to build personalities to make people matter and all that stuff, really. And then also don't do things like have Riho wrestle, like you build people that have been on the show on a weekly basis. You don't just bring in somebody else from another company. You don't bring somebody else that you may not see for a couple of years or whatever, really. So like I said, I really think that they can learn a lot from studying the Knockouts division in the past. Start with Kong and Gail Kim, watch their feud, watch what they did, and then kind of like expand from that and expand into other like factions and groups and stuff like that. Like it's really just an underutilization of the women's division, and also they can also learn what happens when you have people like Mercedes that if she has 9 belts on an ego trip, why that might be counterproductive at this point, or like Tony Storm. Like I think that they don't want Tony Storm to lose, and now they're having Grand Slam Australia, so there might be a fear that she might be a champion, for another like 4 or 5 months really, and just go through undefeated streaks. And then you have Athena, who's a 1,000-day champion, may say, hey, you're not that. She's like maybe a year, and I'm probably like 400 or 500 days away from Hulk Hogan's reign, if I'm correct. Really, I think he was WWE champion, for like 4 years at one point. So she's not that far from breaking like Hulk Hogan's record, if she was champion until like 2027 or something, until like 2027. But then again, it's like, who's going to really, how that's going to help out our rates really. So they really need to do a lot of revamp of the women's division. Look at what they did in TNA wrestling. If they want to do women's tag team titles, or intergender titles, go do that if you feel like there's some money in that, but I do feel that they're doing something wrong with this, and they can learn a lot from the TNA Knockouts division and how they did that better in TNA wrestling.